powerboat screams across the Mediterranean at 100 miles per hour. Behind the wheel sits Andrea Casiraghi, chasing the same thrill that killed his father in these exact waters. One wrong wave, one bad angle, history waiting to repeat itself. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from and don't forget to click subscribe. On a warm summer night in Saint-Tropez, the music pounded through the walls of an exclusive nightclub. Champagne flowed like water from bottles that cost more than most people earned in a month. Models draped themselves across velvet couches, their designer dresses catching the light from crystal chandeliers that cast rainbows across the ceiling. And at the center of it all, surrounded by bodyguards in dark suits and beautiful people in various states of intoxication, two young men laughed and danced as if they owned the world. In a sense, they did. These were Andrea and Pierre Casiraghi, the party princes of Monaco, grandsons of one of Hollywood's greatest legends and heirs to the most glamorous throne in Europe. To the photographers waiting outside, pressed against velvet ropes and shouting questions into the Mediterranean night, they were living proof that fairy tales still exist. Young, handsome, impossibly wealthy, blessed with a lineage that connected them to both movie royalty and actual royalty. Their faces appeared on magazine covers around the world. Their names trended on social media whenever they were spotted with a new companion. Their every movement was tracked, analyzed, and broadcast to millions of people who would never know what it felt like to live as they lived. But what the cameras never captured, what the gossip columns rarely mentioned, was the darkness that shadowed their golden lives, the tragedy that shaped them, the pressures that haunted them, and the secrets they carried behind their perfect smiles. Because the truth about Monaco's party princes was far more complicated than the fairy tale the world wanted to believe. This is the story of Monaco's most famous brothers, a story of privilege and pain, of scandal and survival, of two young men born into a world of unimaginable wealth who discovered that money cannot buy happiness, and that being born a prince comes with a price that few could imagine paying. To understand the Casiraghi brothers, we must first understand the tiny kingdom that made them famous. Monaco is not like other countries. It is not really like anywhere else on Earth. Covering less than 1 square mile along the French Riviera, it is the second smallest nation on Earth, yet it contains more millionaires per capita than anywhere else in the world. Its streets are lined with Ferraris and Bentleys and Rolls-Royces that cost more than most houses. Its harbor is crowded with superyachts that cost more than most people will earn in 10 lifetimes. Floating palaces with helicopter pads and swimming pools and crews of 50. Its casino, the legendary Monte Carlo, has attracted the wealthy and the reckless for over a century, watching fortunes won and lost in single evenings while chandeliers glitter overhead. The principality operates on its own rules. There is no income tax for residents, which is why so many of the world's wealthiest people maintain addresses here, even if they rarely visit. The streets are immaculately clean. The crime rate is virtually non-existent. Everything is beautiful and expensive and slightly unreal, like a movie set that never gets struck. And at the heart of it all stands the palace, perched on a rock overlooking the Mediterranean, home to the Grimaldi family, the oldest ruling dynasty in Europe. The Grimaldis have held Monaco since 1297, when a clever warrior named François Grimaldi disguised himself as a Franciscan monk and seized the fortress that still dominates the Rock of Monaco. According to legend, he knocked on the fortress gate on a cold January night, begging for shelter. When the guards opened the door to admit what they thought was a humble man of God, Grimaldi threw back his robes, revealed the sword hidden beneath, and led his men in a bloody conquest that would establish a dynasty lasting over 7 centuries. For over 700 years, his descendants have ruled this sliver of Mediterranean paradise, surviving wars, revolutions, invasions, and the collapse of empires that surrounded them. They have outlasted the Bourbons of France, the Habsburgs of Austria, and countless other royal houses that once seemed eternal. They have navigated the treacherous waters of European politics with a combination of cunning, compromise, and strategic marriages that kept their tiny principality independent when larger nations fell. But by the mid-20th century, the family faced a different kind of crisis. Monaco was fading. The glamour that had once made it famous was becoming tarnished. The casinos were half empty, their roulette wheels spinning for audiences that grew smaller each year. The tourists were going elsewhere, to newer resorts with fresher attractions. The grand hotels were showing their age. The Grimaldis needed a miracle to restore their principality's luster and secure its future. What they got was a movie star, and everything changed. In 1956, Grace Kelly arrived in Monaco to marry Prince Rainier III. She was 26 years old, an Academy Award-winning actress at the height of her beauty and fame. She had starred in films by Alfred Hitchcock, had been romanced by some of the most famous men in Hollywood, and had achieved a level of celebrity that few performers ever reach. He was a 32-year-old bachelor prince, desperately seeking a wife who could help restore his principality's luster and provide the heir that Monaco's constitution demanded. Their courtship had been brief but intense, beginning at the Cannes Film Festival, where Grace was representing Hollywood and Rainier was representing his tiny nation. Within months, an engagement was announced that stunned the world. The American press couldn't believe that one of their own was about to become royalty. The European aristocracy couldn't believe that a prince was marrying an actress, and yet it happened. Their wedding was called the wedding of the century, a spectacle that outdid anything Hollywood had ever produced. Over 30 million viewers watched on television as Grace Kelly walked down the aisle of St. Nicholas Cathedral in a gown designed by MGM's costume department, a gift from the studio that had made her famous. The ceremony was attended by dignitaries from around the world. The reception lasted for days. Grace Kelly became Princess Grace, trading Hollywood for a real palace, and Monaco was transformed overnight into the most glamorous destination on Earth. The casinos filled again. The tourists returned. The Grimaldi gamble had paid off beyond anyone's wildest dreams. Princess Grace brought more than her beauty to Monaco. She brought 3 children who would become the most photographed royals of their generation. First came Caroline in 1957, then Albert in 1958, and finally Stephanie in 1965. They grew up in a fishbowl of fame, their every move documented by paparazzi who camped outside the palace gates. The pressure was immense. Every outfit was scrutinized. Every friendship was analyzed. Every teenage rebellion was broadcast to the world as evidence of royal dysfunction. Grace herself struggled with the transition from actress to princess. She had given up her career, her independence, and her American freedom for a title and a palace. Some days, the bargain seemed worth it. Other days, she felt trapped in a gilded cage, performing a role she had never auditioned for. She channeled her frustrated creativity into charitable work, into the arts, into raising her children with values that transcended their extraordinary circumstances. She wanted them to understand that privilege was not an achievement, but an accident, and that true worth came from what you did with your advantages, not from the advantages themselves. But of the 3 children, It was Caroline who seemed most destined for drama. She was beautiful like her mother, headstrong like her father, and cursed with a romantic life that would bring her both ecstasy and agony. Caroline's first marriage to Philippe Junot in 1978 ended in scandal after just 2 years. The tabloids feasted on stories of his alleged infidelities, and the divorce left Caroline humiliated and heartbroken. She retreated from public life, nursing her wounds and wondering if she would ever find true love. Then, in 1983, everything changed. At a party in Monaco, Caroline met a young Italian businessman named Stefano Casiraghi. He was 23 years old, athletic, charming, and completely unintimidated by her royal status. Where others saw a princess, Stefano saw a woman. Where others approached with deference, he approached with confidence. Caroline was captivated. Stefano Casiraghi came from a wealthy Milanese family with interests in construction and real estate. His father had built a fortune in the post-war boom, and Stefano had inherited not just money, but a certain fearlessness that came from growing up knowing that failure was not a possibility. But what set him apart was not his money. It was his passion for adventure. Stefano lived for speed and danger. He raced powerboats across open water at over 100 miles per hour, skimming across waves that could flip a lesser vessel, navigating courses that had claimed lives every year. He competed in offshore races that pushed machines and men to their absolute limits. He piloted his boats with a precision that bordered on artistry, feeling the water beneath him as if it were an extension of his own body. He pushed himself to the edge of what was humanly possible, driven by a need for adrenaline that some found thrilling and others found terrifying. Caroline found it irresistible. Perhaps she recognized in him a kindred spirit, someone who refused to be confined by expectations or limitations. Perhaps she was attracted to his complete lack of intimidation by her royal status. Perhaps she simply fell in love the way people do, inexplicably and irrevocably. Whatever the reason, their connection was immediate and intense. They married in 1983, just months after meeting, in a civil ceremony at the palace. Unlike her first wedding, which had been a grand public spectacle complete with world leaders and celebrities, this one was intimate and private. Only close family and friends attended. Caroline had learned her lesson about fairy tale weddings. This time, she wanted substance over spectacle. This time, she wanted forever. The marriage was, by all accounts, genuinely happy. Stefano adored Caroline, and she adored him. He made her laugh in ways she hadn't laughed since her mother died. He refused to treat her like a princess, teasing her mercilessly, challenging her opinions, treating her as an equal rather than a figurehead. For Caroline, who had spent her entire life being approached with deference and distance, this was intoxicating. Together, they built a family with remarkable speed. Their first child, Andrea Albert Pierre, was born on June 8, 1984. He arrived healthy and strong, a dark-haired boy with his father's intense eyes and his mother's aristocratic cheekbones. Charlotte Marie Pomeline followed on August 3, 1986, a beautiful girl who would grow up to be as photographed as any movie star. And Pierre Renier Stefano arrived on September 5, 1987, completing the family that Caroline had dreamed of since her disastrous first marriage. 3 children in 3 years. The Casiraghi family seemed blessed beyond measure. They had youth, beauty, wealth, and love. They had a palace to call home and a principality at their feet. They spent summers sailing the Mediterranean, winters skiing in the Alps, and every moment in between surrounded by the warmth of extended family and loyal friends. Stefano was a devoted father, endlessly patient with his children, always ready with a game or a story or a tickle fight that left everyone breathless with laughter. Caroline watched him with their babies and felt her heart overflow with gratitude for this second chance at happiness. They had everything anyone could want. And then, in a single moment, they had nothing. The morning of October 3rd, 1990, dawned bright and clear over the waters near Monaco. The Mediterranean was calm, almost glassy, with only the gentlest swells rolling toward the shore. Stefano Casiraghi was competing in the offshore powerboat world championship, racing his boat toward what he hoped would be another victory. He had won this race before. He knew these waters better than almost anyone alive. He was one of the best powerboat racers in the world, respected by competitors and feared by rivals. That morning, he had kissed Caroline goodbye and promised to be home for dinner. It was a promise he had made 100 times before, and she had no reason to doubt him. She had long ago made her peace with his dangerous hobby, understanding that asking him to stop would be asking him to stop being himself. She watched him leave with the familiar mixture of pride and anxiety that had become part of her daily existence. But on this day, something went terribly wrong. At speeds approaching 100 miles per hour, racing neck and neck with another competitor, Stefano's boat hit a wave at precisely the wrong angle. The catamaran lifted into the air, flipped, and came crashing down with a force that no human body could survive. Rescue teams reached the wreckage within minutes, but there was nothing to be done. Stefano Casiraghi was killed instantly. He was 30 years old. He would never see his children grow up. He would never grow old with the woman he loved. He would never know that his death would cast a shadow over his sons that would last for decades. The news reached Caroline within hours. She collapsed. The woman who had survived scandal and divorce, who had rebuilt her life around this man and this family, was suddenly a widow with 3 children under the age of 7. Andrea was 6. Charlotte was 4. Pierre was just 3 years old. They were too young to understand what had happened, too young to process the meaning of the black clothes and the tears and the funeral that followed. All they knew was that their father, the laughing man who had thrown them in the air and raced them around the palace gardens, was never coming home. The funeral was held on October 8, 1990, at the Cathedral of Monaco. The same church where Grace Kelly had married Prince Rainier 34 years earlier now hosted the grief of a family that had already known too much sorrow. Princess Grace herself had died in a car accident in 1982, leaving Caroline to mourn her mother at just 25 years old. Now, 8 years later, Caroline was burying her husband. The Grimaldi curse, as some called it, seemed relentlessly determined to claim those closest to her. In the weeks and months that followed, Caroline retreated from public life entirely. She moved her children away from Monaco, first to a family estate in Provence, then to other locations where she could shield them from the cameras and the questions. The paparazzi, sensing a story of grief and vulnerability, became more aggressive than ever. They camped outside gates and followed cars and shouted questions at children too young to understand why strangers with cameras wanted to make them cry. Caroline hired security. She varied her routes. She taught her children to keep their heads down and their expressions neutral. She became a lioness protecting her cubs from a world that wanted to devour them. She was determined that Andrea, Charlotte, and Pierre would have as normal a childhood as possible, even though normalcy was an impossible dream for children of their bloodline. She enrolled them in regular schools where they were expected to do their own homework and face their own consequences. She insisted they learn to do their own laundry, make their own beds, earn their own spending money through chores and good grades. She refused to let servants wait on them hand and foot. She wanted them to understand that their privilege came with responsibility, that their wealth was not an excuse for laziness or arrogance, that the accident of their birth did not make them better than anyone else. But no amount of careful parenting could erase the wound that had been carved into their souls. The trauma of losing a father at such a young age leaves scars that no amount of therapy can fully heal. Andrea, as the eldest, seemed to feel the loss most acutely. He had memories of his father that his younger siblings didn't share. He remembered the boat races, the laughter, the feeling of being held in strong arms that would never hold him again. He remembered the way his father smelled after a race. Salt and sweat and engine oil. He remembered the sound of his voice, deep and reassuring, promising that everything would be all right. And he remembered the day everything changed. The day his mother's face crumpled and the adults started crying, and nobody would tell him exactly what had happened to Papa. As he grew older, friends and family noticed a restlessness in him, a need to prove himself that bordered on recklessness. He took up extreme sports with an intensity that worried his mother. Skiing, snowboarding, surfing, anything that involved speed and danger and the possibility of injury. He pushed boundaries constantly. He tested limits as if daring the universe to hurt him the way it had hurt his father. Some said he was searching for something, a connection to the man he had lost, a way to feel close to a ghost. Others said he was running from something, from the grief that threatened to swallow him whole if he ever stopped moving long enough to feel it. Perhaps both were true. Perhaps neither was. The heart of a grieving child is a mystery that even the child himself cannot fully understand. Pierre, the youngest, had the fewest memories of Stefano, but seemed to carry a different kind of burden. He was the baby of the family, often overshadowed by his older siblings, constantly compared to a father he barely remembered. Where Andrea was bold and Charlotte was graceful, Pierre seemed to struggle to find his place. He was quieter, more reserved, more prone to the melancholy that sometimes afflicts those who grow up in the shadow of tragedy. But he was also, those who knew him said, the most sensitive of the three. The one who felt things most deeply, the one who would later surprise everyone with the depth of his passion and the intensity of his commitments. As the 1990s gave way to the 2000s, the Casiraghi children began to emerge from their mother's protective shadow. Andrea, now a teenager, was attending the exclusive La Rosey boarding school in Switzerland, rubbing shoulders with the children of billionaires and royalty from around the world. He was handsome in a way that combined his mother's aristocratic features with his father's athletic build. He was charming. He was popular, and he was beginning to discover the pleasures and perils of being young, rich, and famous in a world that was increasingly obsessed with celebrity. The paparazzi, who had been kept at bay during his childhood by security and his mother's fierce protectiveness, now descended with renewed fervor. They staked out his school. They bribed hotel staff for information. They followed his car through the streets of Monaco and Paris and London, their cameras clicking like machine guns whenever he stepped into public view. Every girlfriend was photographed, analyzed, and compared to previous girlfriends. Every party was documented in excruciating detail. Every stumble, every questionable decision, every moment of youthful indiscretion was captured and broadcast to a global audience hungry for glimpses of royal scandal. Andrea handled the attention, with a mixture of grace and defiance that would define his public persona. He didn't hide from the cameras, understanding that hiding only made them more aggressive. But he didn't perform for them either. He refused to smile on command or answer shouted questions or give them the dramatic reaction shots they craved. He lived his life on his own terms. Consequences be damned. If he wanted to party until dawn in Saint-Tropez, he would party until dawn in Saint-Tropez. If he wanted to race cars at dangerous speeds, he would race cars at dangerous speeds. If he wanted to date women who set the tabloids on fire, he would date them unapologetically and let the world think what it wanted. He was his father's son, after all. And like his father, he refused to let fear dictate his choices. Pierre, meanwhile, was developing a reputation of a different sort. Less flashy than his brother, less likely to end up on the cover of tabloid magazines. He was nonetheless becoming known in certain circles as a connoisseur of nightlife and a collector of experiences. He frequented the same clubs as Andrea, but seemed to prefer the shadows to the spotlight. Where Andrea would hold court at the center of the VIP section, Pierre would be in the corner, watching, observing, taking mental notes on the strange world he inhabited. He surrounded himself with a tight circle of friends, many of them also the children of extraordinary privilege, young people who understood without explanation the peculiar pressures of growing up with famous last names and unlimited credit cards. Together, they explored the pleasure palaces of Europe with the enthusiasm of young people who had never been told no and never experienced the word impossible. Monte Carlo's most exclusive private rooms, Saint-Tropez's legendary beach clubs, Ibiza's all-night parties that lasted until the sun rose over the Mediterranean, London's members-only establishments where the waiting list stretched for years, New York's velvet-roped sanctuaries where celebrities and billionaires mingled with wannabes and hangers-on. Wherever the party was, Pierre and his friends would find it. They were young, they were rich, and they were determined to experience everything the world had to offer before responsibility came calling. By the time Andrea turned 21 in 2005, the tabloids had crowned him the most eligible bachelor in Europe. He was wealthy beyond imagination, with a trust fund that generated more income in a year than most people would see in a lifetime. He was connected to one of the most famous families in the world, a lineage that opened doors that remained firmly closed to ordinary mortals, and he was possessed of the kind of dark good looks that made women swoon and men envious, a combination of Italian passion and aristocratic refinement that photographers loved and fashion magazines celebrated. He could have had anyone. Models threw themselves at him. Actresses sought introductions. Socialites plotted and schemed to catch his attention at parties. He could have done anything, pursued any career, lived anywhere in the world. The world was quite literally at his feet, waiting for him to decide what he wanted to do with the extraordinary advantages he had been given. And yet, those who knew him well detected something hollow at the center of all that glitter. A sadness that no amount of champagne could wash away. A searching quality that no number of beautiful women could satisfy. A restlessness that drove him from party to party, city to city, relationship to relationship, always looking for something he couldn't quite name and never quite finding it. The golden boy of Monaco, the prince charming of 1,000 tabloid stories, was carrying a weight that no one could see and he couldn't put down. The brothers began to be spotted together more frequently at the hottest nightclubs in Europe. VIP rooms would clear to make space for them. Bottles of Cristal would appear as if by magic. Models and actresses would cluster around their table, hoping to catch the eye of a real-life prince. Andrea and Pierre navigated this world with the ease of people who had been born to it, who had never known anything else. They tipped extravagantly. They treated everyone with casual courtesy. They never made a scene, never caused a disturbance, never gave the club owners reason to regret opening their doors. But the party lifestyle was taking its toll in ways that were becoming impossible to hide. Photos from this era show young men who look older than their years, their faces showing the wear of too many late nights, their eyes carrying a weariness that belied their youth. There were mornings when they didn't come home at all, evenings that blurred into afternoons, weekends that stretched into weeks. The champagne never stopped flowing. The music never stopped playing. The beautiful people never stopped arriving. It was a carousel that spun faster and faster, and getting off seemed impossible. Friends later admitted that there were concerns, serious concerns. That the brothers seemed to be self-medicating, using pleasure to avoid pain, using distraction to escape from questions they didn't want to answer. The grief they had carried since childhood had never been properly processed. The expectations placed upon them had never been properly examined. And now, in their 20s, with the world telling them they could have anything they wanted, they were discovering that what they wanted most was something no amount of money could buy. Peace. Purpose. A sense that their lives meant something beyond the parties and the privilege. Who were they really beneath the titles and the trust funds? What did they want from life? And could they ever escape the shadow of a father they had lost before they truly knew him? The answer, it seemed, was no. The shadow of Stefano Casiraghi hung over everything his sons did like a ghost that refused to be exorcised. When Andrea took up powerboat racing in his 20s, the parallels were impossible to ignore and painful to contemplate. Here was the son of a man killed in a racing accident, climbing into boats nearly identical to the one that had claimed his father's life, pushing himself to speeds that would make most people's blood run cold. The engines roared, the spray flew, the shore became a blur, and Andrea felt for those moments something close to peace, or perhaps something close to his father. When reporters asked if he was trying to prove something, Andrea would smile his charming smile and change the subject with practiced ease. When they asked if he thought about his father during races, he would go quiet, his eyes looking at something far away that only he could see. Some wounds, his silence seemed to say, were too deep for words. Some connections were too sacred to explain to strangers with microphones and deadlines. Pierre, for his part, channeled his restless energy in different directions. He became passionate about photography, spending hours capturing images that revealed a sensitivity at odds with his party boy reputation. He developed an interest in journalism and media, eventually working for various publications and proving that he was more than just a name and a face. He seemed determined to make his own mark on the world, to be known for something other than his last name and his nightclub appearances. Whether he succeeded would depend on his ability to escape the gravitational pull of privilege and pleasure that had defined his young life. As the first decade of the new millennium drew to a close, the Casiraghi brothers stood at a crossroads. They were no longer boys. Andrea was approaching 30. Pierre was in his mid-20s. The time for youthful excess was supposed to be ending. The time for responsibility was supposed to be beginning. Their uncle, Prince Albert II, now ruled Monaco, but he had no legitimate children. The succession remained uncertain, and lurking in the background was always the question that no one wanted to ask directly. What kind of men would Andrea and Pierre become? Would they rise to meet the expectations of their bloodline? Or would they remain forever what the tabloids had made them? Party princes dancing through life without purpose or direction. The answers would come in the years ahead, but they would not come easily. The dark story of Monaco's party princes was only beginning. There were scandals still to break, secrets still to be revealed, and tragedies still to be endured. The brothers would face tests that would push them to their limits and force them to confront the wounds they had carried since childhood. They would fall in love and have their hearts broken. They would make mistakes and pay the price. They would discover, as so many before them had discovered, that being born into a fairy tale does not guarantee a happy ending. But all of that lay ahead. On that summer night in Saint-Tropez, as the music played and the champagne flowed and the cameras flashed outside, Andrea and Pierre Casiraghi were still young, still beautiful, still blessed and cursed in equal measure by the accident of their birth. They danced as if they had not a care in the world, as if tomorrow would never come, as if the darkness that lurked at the edges of their gilded existence could be held at bay forever by the sheer force of their will to have a good time. The DJ played their favorite songs. The bottles kept coming. Beautiful strangers pressed close, hoping for a moment of connection with these princes who seemed to have everything. Outside, the paparazzi waited with the patience of predators, knowing that eventually the princes would emerge. And when they did, the cameras would capture whatever happened next. Andrea checked his phone and saw a message from a woman he had been seeing. Someone new. Someone who made him feel things he had thought he was incapable of feeling. He smiled. A real smile, not the practiced expression he gave the cameras. Pierre noticed and raised an eyebrow. Andrea just shrugged. Some things, his gesture seemed to say, were too new to discuss. Some possibilities were too fragile to put into words. They were wrong, of course. Tomorrow always comes. The sun would rise over the Mediterranean, burning away the illusions of the night. Decisions would have to be made. Responsibilities would have to be faced. The question of who they really were, beneath the titles and the headlines and the expectations, would have to be answered eventually. And for the Casiraghi brothers, tomorrow would bring revelations that would shock even those who thought they knew them best. Love stories would unfold that nobody saw coming. Transformations would occur that defied every prediction. The party princes of Monaco would become something else entirely, something that would surprise the world, and perhaps themselves most of all. The party was far from over, but the price of admission was about to come due. And what happened next would change the story of the Casiraghi brothers forever. The transformation began, as so many transformations do, with love. Not the fleeting infatuations that had filled the tabloids for years. The models and actresses who drifted through their lives like beautiful ghosts, leaving nothing behind but photographs and rumors. This was something different, something real, something that would force Andrea and Pierre Casiraghi to become the men they were always capable of being, the men their father might have been if fate had given him more time. The change didn't happen overnight. There was no single moment of revelation, no dramatic awakening that could be captured for magazine covers. Instead, it was a gradual shift, like the turning of a tide, so slow that those watching couldn't pinpoint exactly when it began. But begin it did, and once it started, there was no going back. For Andrea, love arrived in the form of Tatiana Santo Domingo, a Colombian-born heiress whose family fortune rivaled the Grimaldi's own. The Santo Domingos had built their wealth in brewing, creating an empire that stretched across South America and made them one of the richest families on the continent. Tatiana had grown up with the same combination of privilege and pressure that Andrea knew so well. The same fishbowl existence, the same expectations, the same inability to know whether people liked you for yourself or for your bank account. They had known each other for years, moving in the same circles of extreme privilege, attending the same parties, skiing the same slopes in Gstaad, swimming off the same yachts in the Mediterranean. But it wasn't until the late 2000s that something shifted between them. Friends noticed they were spending more time together, laughing more easily, looking at each other with an intensity that went beyond casual friendship. There was a connection forming that seemed to surprise both of them. Tatiana was unlike the women Andrea had dated before. She wasn't impressed by his title or intimidated by his family. She had her own identity, her own ambitions, her own reasons for being that had nothing to do with being seen on the arm of a prince. She was studying environmental science, passionate about sustainability in ways that seemed almost quaint among their pleasure-seeking peers. She had opinions she defended fiercely, and a sharp wit that could cut through pretension like a blade through silk. She challenged him. She called him out when he was being ridiculous. She refused to let him hide behind the charm that had always worked on everyone else. For Andrea, who had spent his entire adult life being pursued and fawned over, being treated as a prize to be won rather than a person to be known, this was revolutionary. Here was someone who saw past the title and the trust fund to the wounded boy underneath. Here was someone who understood the weight he carried without requiring him to explain it. Here was someone who made him want to be better, not for her sake, but for his own. Their courtship was conducted largely out of the spotlight, a remarkable achievement given the intensity of interest in both families. They traveled together to remote locations where paparazzi couldn't follow. They spent quiet weekends at family estates where security kept the cameras at bay. They built a relationship on a foundation of genuine connection rather than public performance. And slowly, gradually, the party prince began to change. Friends noticed it first. Andrea was drinking less, staying out less, spending more time in quiet conversation and less time at the center of crowded dance floors. He started talking about the future in ways he never had before. He began to take more interest in the family's philanthropic work. He even started reading books again, something he had abandoned in favor of nightclub VIP rooms years earlier. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was the slow emergence of a man who had been buried under years of grief and distraction. In August of 2013, Andrea and Tatiana were married in Monaco. The civil ceremony was held at the palace, witnessed by the royal family and close friends, in the same rooms where generations of Grimaldis had pledged their vows before them. Caroline watched her eldest son say his vows with tears streaming down her face, seeing in him the echo of another wedding, another time, when she had been the one standing at the altar with a man she loved beyond reason. The religious ceremony followed a few days later at a church near the Santo Domingo family estate in Colombia. The setting was spectacular, a colonial church surrounded by mountains and jungle, a world away from the manicured perfection of Monaco. Guests had traveled from around the world, private jets filling the local airport, to witness the union of two of the world's wealthiest young families. But despite the scale of the gathering, both celebrations were deliberately understated by royal standards. There were no massive crowds, no global television broadcasts, no stadium-sized guest lists. Just two people who had found each other and wanted to celebrate that discovery with those they loved. For Andrea, the wedding represented something more than the beginning of a marriage. It represented the end of an era. The party prince was settling down. The most eligible bachelor in Europe was officially off the market. and the tabloids, which had spent years chronicling his exploits with a mixture of fascination and judgment, would have to find new stories to tell. Some seemed almost disappointed. Wild Andrea had been good copy. Married Andrea would be considerably less interesting. But Andrea's transformation wasn't just about finding a wife. Fatherhood would complete the change that love had begun, would finish the work of healing that had started when he first realized Tatiana saw him for who he really was. In March of 2014, Tatiana gave birth to their first child, a boy named Alexandre Andrea Stefano. The first name was strong and classical. The middle name honored Andrea himself, and through him, his mother's family. The last name was a tribute to the father Andrea had lost. The grandfather this child would never know, except through stories and photographs, and the love his absence had somehow made possible. When Andrea held his son for the first time, something inside him finally broke open. All the walls he had built, all the defenses he had constructed, all the masks he had worn to get through the days and nights of his searching 20s, crumbled to dust. The grief he had carried for 24 years, the loss of the father he barely remembered, the questions that had haunted his every achievement and failure. All of it came flooding out in tears he didn't try to hide. The nurses discreetly left the room. Tatiana watched her husband with a mixture of love and understanding that required no words. This was the moment she had sensed was coming, the breakthrough that all his partying and racing and running had been postponing. She simply held his hand and let him feel what he needed to feel. Here, in his arms, was a second chance, an opportunity to be the father he had lost, a chance to give his son the stability and presence and unconditional love that had been stolen from him by a freak accident on a Mediterranean morning. Andrea looked at Alexandra's tiny face and made a silent promise. He would be there, for every scraped knee and every nightmare, for every triumph and every failure, for every moment, big and small, that makes up a childhood. He would not miss it. He would not let anything take him away from this child the way his father had been taken from him. The vow changed him in ways that surprised even those who knew him best. Andrea stopped racing powerboats. The sport that had connected him to his father's memory, that had given him a way to feel close to a ghost, was suddenly too dangerous to justify. He had his own son now. He had responsibilities that outweighed his need for adrenaline. When reporters asked why he had retired from racing, Andrea was characteristically brief. "My priorities changed," he said, and that was all the explanation he offered. More children followed. India, a daughter, arrived in April of 2016. Maximilian, another son, came in April of 2018. With each birth, Andrea seemed to settle more deeply into his role as father and family man. The restlessness that had defined his 20s was replaced by a contentment that seemed almost foreign to those who remembered the wild young prince of the Saint-Tropez nights. He still appeared at official events, still fulfilled his duties as a senior member of the Monaco royal family. But the partying was done. The late nights were over. When photographers caught him now, he was usually with his children, walking them to school or playing with them in parks, looking not like a prince but like any other devoted father. The transformation was complete. The party prince had become a family man. Pierre's journey to transformation followed a different path, but arrived at a similar destination. His awakening came through Beatrice Borromeo, an Italian journalist and television personality whose aristocratic lineage stretched back centuries to the very heart of European nobility. The Borromeo family had produced cardinals, saints, and some of the most influential figures in Italian history. Their family palace on an island in Lake Maggiore, Isola Bella, was one of the most spectacular private residences in Europe. A Baroque masterpiece filled with art and gardens that had taken generations to perfect. Beatrice brought to the relationship a combination of beauty, intelligence, and family pride that matched anything the Grimaldis could offer. In some ways, she outshone them. Her family's history was longer, their cultural contributions greater, their position in European society more deeply rooted. They met in 2008 at a party in Milan, when Pierre was still deep in his party phase, and Beatrice was building her career as a journalist, covering politics and current events for Italian television. She was not the type to be impressed by titles. She had grown up surrounded by counts and princes and cardinals. A Monegasque royal was interesting, but hardly overwhelming. What caught her attention was Pierre himself, the intelligence behind his eyes, the way he listened when she spoke, the unexpected depth that revealed itself in conversation. Their initial connection was intellectual as much as romantic. Beatrice was fascinated by Pierre's perspective on fame and privilege, the insider's view of a world she reported on but didn't quite belong to. She asked questions that journalists usually asked, but without the aggressive edge of someone seeking scandal. She genuinely wanted to understand. Pierre was fascinated by her curiosity, her ambition, her refusal to be impressed by surface glitter. Here was a woman who valued substance over style, who cared more about what you thought than what you owned. They talked for hours that first night, debating politics and art and the meaning of their respective positions in a world that was changing faster than either of them could comprehend. When they finally parted, both knew something significant had begun. The relationship developed slowly, punctuated by long separations and the challenges of maintaining intimacy across busy schedules and geographic distances. Beatrice continued her journalism career, traveling the world to cover stories that mattered to her, building a reputation that was entirely her own and had nothing to do with the prince who was increasingly present in her life. Pierre continued his own exploration of media and photography, searching for a creative identity that was his alone, determined not to be defined solely by his family connections. They supported each other's ambitions, even when those ambitions pulled them in different directions. They understood, perhaps better than most couples, that independence and love were not mutually exclusive. What made their relationship work, friends later observed, was a fundamental respect for each other's independence. Neither tried to change the other. Neither demanded sacrifice or submission. They came together as complete individuals who enhanced each other's lives rather than dependent partners who couldn't function alone. For Pierre, who had spent his childhood in the shadow of tragedy and his early adulthood in the shadow of his brother, this recognition of his individual worth was transformative. In 2015, Pierre and Beatrice were married in 2 ceremonies that captured the attention of royal watchers around the world and were celebrated as among the most beautiful weddings of the decade. The civil ceremony was held at the Pink Palace in Monaco, the official residence of the Grimaldi family. Witnessed by the royal family and close friends in a setting of understated elegance. Beatrice wore a pale pink Valentino gown that set social media ablaze with admiration. Pierre looked at her as if he still couldn't quite believe his luck. But it was the religious ceremony, held a week later on the Borromeo family's private island in Lake Maggiore, that truly stole the world's breath. Isola Bella had been transformed into a wedding wonderland, its Baroque gardens lit by thousands of candles, its terraces draped in flowers, its ancient stones bearing witness to a love story that united two of Europe's great families. Guests arrived by boat, gliding across the lake as the sun set behind the Alps, stepping onto the island as if entering a dream. Beatrice wore a series of stunning gowns designed by Armani, each more beautiful than the last, changing throughout the celebration like a butterfly emerging anew with each transformation. The ceremony itself was held in the family chapel, a jewel box of frescoes and gold that had hosted Borromeo weddings for centuries. Pierre looked happier than anyone had ever seen him, the weight he had carried since childhood seemingly lifted at last. When they exchanged vows, his voice broke with emotion. The photographs from that weekend showed a couple genuinely in love, not performing for cameras, but celebrating a connection that felt almost sacred. Even the tabloids, usually so cynical about royal romance, seemed moved by what they witnessed. Like his brother, Pierre's transformation accelerated with the arrival of children. Stefano Ercole Carlo was born in February of 2017, named in honor of the grandfather he would never meet. The name was a deliberate choice, a way of keeping Stefano Casiraghi's memory alive in the next generation, of giving the lost father a presence in the family he had been denied by death. Pierre held his newborn son and thought about the man who had held him the same way nearly 30 years before. The man whose face he knew only from photographs, whose voice he couldn't remember, whose absence had shaped everything about his life. Francesco Carlo Albert followed in May of 2018. With each child, Pierre seemed to shed more of the restlessness and uncertainty that had defined his earlier years. He stopped appearing in nightclub photographs. He started appearing in family photographs, holding babies and playing with toddlers and looking every inch the devoted father he had become. The brothers' parallel transformations did not go unnoticed by observers of the Monaco scene. The wild Casiraghi boys, the party princes who had seemed destined to spend their lives in an endless cycle of pleasure-seeking and scandal, had somehow become responsible adults. They had found love, started families, and begun to take their roles in the Grimaldi dynasty seriously. The question that had haunted them for so long, what kind of men would they become, finally had an answer. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their transformation was how they dealt with the legacy of trauma that had shaped their early lives. Instead of running from their father's memory, instead of continuing to avoid the pain that his death had caused, they began to honor it in new ways. Andrea stopped racing boats, but started supporting safety initiatives in powerboat racing, using his name and resources and connections to prevent other families from suffering the loss his had suffered. He funded research into vessel design that could better protect drivers in high-speed accidents. He spoke at safety conferences, sharing his family's story with an openness that would have been unimaginable in his younger years. The sport that had taken his father became a cause he championed, a way of turning tragedy into purpose. Pierre became involved in children's charities, particularly those focused on grief counseling and support for children who had lost parents. He understood, in ways that those who haven't experienced such loss cannot fully comprehend, what those children were going through. He knew the confusion and the anger and the desperate search for meaning that follows the death of a parent. He knew how it shapes everything that comes after, how it colors every achievement and every failure, how it never really goes away even when you think you've made peace with it. He wanted to help other children navigate that journey, to give them resources and support that might have helped him if they had existed when he was a grieving 3-year-old, trying to understand why his father wasn't coming home. The wound that had nearly destroyed them became a source of purpose and meaning. The brothers discovered what psychologists call post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon by which those who suffer can sometimes emerge from their suffering with greater depth, greater compassion, greater appreciation for what matters in life. Their pain had not been for nothing. It had prepared them to help others. It had given them a perspective that those who have lived easier lives simply cannot possess. Their mother, Princess Caroline, watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and relief that was evident to anyone who saw her with her sons and grandchildren. She had spent decades worrying about them, lying awake at night, wondering if the trauma of losing Stefano would forever prevent them from finding happiness. She had watched them struggle through their 20s, had read the tabloid stories with a mother's combination of concern and frustration, had prayed that they would eventually find their way out of the darkness that seemed to surround them. She had lost so much herself. Her mother in a car accident when Caroline was only 25. Her husband in a racing accident when she was 33. She had known grief so profound that it threatened to swallow her whole, and she had survived it only because her children needed her to survive. Now, watching Andrea and Pierre become the men they had become, she felt something she had almost forgotten was possible. Hope. Not the desperate hope of the grieving years, the hope that simply clung to survival, but a softer hope, a warmer hope, the hope that comes from seeing your children find happiness. Family gatherings in Monaco took on a new character as grandchildren multiplied and the palace filled with the sounds of a new generation. The halls that had once seemed haunted by tragedy now echoed with the laughter of children playing. Caroline could look around her dining table and see not just survivors of loss, but builders of something new. Andrea with Tatiana and their 3 children, Alexandra learning to sail, India collecting seashells, Maximilian just beginning to walk, Pierre with Beatrice and their 2 sons, Stefano already showing his father's quiet intensity, Francesco babbling in the mixture of Italian and French that was his family's linguistic inheritance, Charlotte with her children, the cousins playing together, forming bonds that would last their lifetimes, the Casiraghi dynasty that had nearly been broken by one morning on the Mediterranean was thriving, expanding, proving that life continues even after the worst imaginable loss. The family that grief had threatened to destroy was now stronger than ever, its bonds forged in shared suffering and strengthened by shared joy. The brothers themselves grew closer as they matured. The sibling dynamics that had been complicated by their different personalities and positions in the family hierarchy simplified into genuine friendship. They spent time together not because photographers were watching or family obligations demanded it, but because they enjoyed each other's company. They went on family vacations together, their children becoming as close as they themselves had been as boys. They supported each other's projects and celebrated each other's successes with a generosity of spirit that spoke to real affection rather than dutiful performance. Andrea took on more official responsibilities in Monaco, representing the principality at events and functions that prepared him for whatever role he might eventually play in its governance. Pierre continued to develop his interests in media and journalism, building a career that was genuinely his own while still honoring his obligations to the family. Both brothers found ways to be both royal and individual, meeting the expectations of their bloodline while still maintaining the personal identities they had worked so hard to establish. The reconciliation with their father's memory was perhaps the most healing aspect of their journey. As their own children grew, Andrea and Pierre found themselves telling stories about Stefano that they had never shared before, stories that had been too painful to speak aloud when the wound was still fresh. They showed their kids photographs from the racing days, explaining who the young man in the boat was and why he mattered. They described his laugh, his energy, his fearlessness on the water. They visited places that had been important to their father, creating new memories in spaces haunted by old grief. The waters where he had raced, the restaurants where he had celebrated victories, the corners of Monaco where he had lived his too short life. They said his name out loud, something that had been too painful for years, and found that speaking it no longer hurt. It felt instead like an honoring. On the anniversary of Stefano's death each October, the family gathered quietly to remember. These were not public ceremonies or media events, but private moments of reflection, held away from cameras and crowds. A chance to honor a man who had been taken too soon, and to acknowledge the shadow he still cast over their lives. They would look at photographs and share memories, and sometimes just sit in silence together. But the shadow was different now. It was no longer the darkness that threatened to swallow them. It was the shade of a tree under which they could rest. A reminder of where they came from and what they had survived. Stefano had died young, but his sons had lived. They had struggled and suffered, but they had survived. And now they were passing on his legacy to children who would carry it into a future he would never see. The tabloids, which had built careers on chronicling the Casiraghi brothers' wild years, gradually lost interest in them. Family men pushing strollers through parks don't sell magazines. Devoted fathers attending school plays don't generate clicks. The party princes who had once dominated gossip columns faded from those pages, replaced by new scandals and new celebrities. For Andrea and Pierre, this obscurity was a gift. They had earned the privacy that their money and security could provide, but that their behavior had previously compromised. Today, as the 2020s unfold, Andrea and Pierre Casiraghi stand as examples of something the world desperately wants to believe is possible. That people can change. That trauma doesn't have to define a life. That privilege, which so often corrupts and isolates, can sometimes be channeled into purpose and connection. That the wild boys dancing in nightclubs can become the devoted fathers pushing swings in playgrounds. That fairy tales, even dark ones that begin with tragedy and continue through years of searching, can have happy endings. Andrea has become a leader in Monaco's business community, using his position and connections to attract investment and innovation to the principality. He serves on the boards of companies and charities, bringing the same intensity he once brought to partying to more constructive pursuits. He is mentioned as a possible future regent, someone who might play a significant role in Monaco's governance as the next generation comes of age. The wild boy has become a statesman in waiting. Pierre has found his voice as a creative force, producing documentaries and supporting media projects that tell stories he cares about. His photography has been exhibited in galleries. His journalism has been published in respected outlets. He has proven that being born a prince doesn't have to limit your options, that you can be both royal and individual, both privileged and productive. The overlooked youngest son has become an artist in his own right. They are not perfect, of course. No one is. They still carry the scars of their early loss and their years of searching for something to fill the void their father left behind. They still struggle sometimes with the pressures of their position and the expectations that come with their names. They still have moments when the old restlessness returns, when the siren call of escape whispers that there must be more than responsibility and routine. They are human beings, not saints, and their transformation has not erased their flaws. But they have found something that anchors them now: love, family, purpose. The knowledge that their children are watching, learning, absorbing lessons about what it means to be a man from fathers who are determined to be present in ways their own father couldn't be. The cycle of loss that had threatened to define the Casiraghi legacy has been broken. A new cycle of healing has taken its place. In Monaco, the sun still sets over the Mediterranean in spectacular displays of orange and pink that tourists photograph and locals barely notice anymore. The super yachts still crowd the harbor, their billionaire owners coming and going with the seasons. The casino still glitters through the night, fortunes still won and lost at tables that have seen it all. The palace still stands on its rock overlooking the principality, home to a dynasty that has endured for over 700 years and shows no signs of ending. The Grimaldi story continues, generation after generation, adapting and surviving and proving that some things do last. And somewhere in that palace, or perhaps in one of the private homes scattered around the principality, or maybe on a beach in the Caribbean or a ski slope in the Alps, Andrea and Pierre Casiraghi are likely doing something unremarkable, helping with homework, reading bedtime stories, having dinner with their wives, watching their children grow, living the quiet lives that no one expected from them, that they barely expected from themselves, that have turned out to be the greatest achievement of their remarkable existence. The party princes have become family men. The playboys have become patriarchs. The boys who lost their father have become fathers themselves, breaking the cycle of absence and loss that had threatened to define their lives forever. The paparazzi rarely bother with them anymore. What would they photograph? A man walking his children to school? A couple having coffee at a sidewalk cafe? The drama that once surrounded them has evaporated, replaced by a normalcy that is far more valuable than any headline. They have earned this peace. They have paid for it with years of searching and struggle, and finally, thankfully, growth. The party princes of Monaco grew up. They found love. They became fathers. They made peace with their past. And in doing so, they wrote an ending to their story that nobody saw coming. Not a fairy tale ending, exactly, because fairy tales don't acknowledge the pain that comes before the happily ever after. But something better. A real ending. A human ending. An ending that proves even those born into extraordinary circumstances can find ordinary happiness. Stefano Casiraghi never got to see his sons become men. He never got to meet his grandchildren or walk his daughter down the aisle or grow old with the woman he loved. The accident that took his life stole all those moments from him and cast a shadow over his family that lasted for decades. But if he could see them now, Andrea and Pierre, the boys he held as babies and dreamed dreams for, he would be proud. Not of their titles or their wealth or their positions in one of the world's most famous families, but of who they have become, the fathers they are, the husbands they are, the men they are. That is the true ending of the dark story of Monaco's party princes. Not darkness at all in the end, but light. Not tragedy, but triumph. Not the endless night of grief and searching, but the dawn of something new. A legacy of love passed down from a father who didn't live to see it bloom, through sons who nearly lost their way, to grandchildren who will grow up knowing that they come from a family that bends but does not break. The Casiraghi story continues. New chapters are being written every day in the laughter of children and the quiet moments of family life. The party is over. But something better has taken its place, and that, perhaps, is the greatest miracle of all.